welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7. Today we're going to continue our look at the story of the Brewster Buffalo, or rather the 239 export variant, in Finnish service against the Soviets in the Continuation War. Just a word before we start, I really enjoy making these series. I'm trying to devote more time to cover a wider variety of topics and to produce more videos. I could use the support of any of those who enjoy this content, so if you're so inclined, there's a link to my Patreon in the description of this video, as well as the sources of the information that I'm using for it. I'd like to make this a full-time thing if I could. So, that being said, let's get back to the story. We left the story of the Brewster in Finnish skies last time in December of 1941. Mannerheim had halted the advance of the Army of Karelia, having reached the pre-Winter War border and reclaimed the isthmus from Soviet occupation. Elsewhere, the Finns had pushed the Soviets from the rest of the lost territory. The Karelian Isthmus, which lies between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, was in their hands, and their troops were in artillery range of the Leningrad defensive zone. The next isthmus over, the Olenets, between Lake Ladoga and Lake Onega, had also been taken up to the line of the river Svir, which runs across its southeastern end. Northwards from the big lakes, the front line ran more or less north-south across marshes, forests, smaller lakes, and tundra to the White Sea coast. Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe forces were present in the theater along with the Finnish army. Their major concentration was in the north in the vicinity of the coast. Here they were focused on taking the ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Allied Lend-Lease aid was beginning to arrive here aboard convoys fought through the Arctic Sea. The initial offensive in the far north had stalled out short of the ports in the rugged terrain of the Litsa River Valley. Remained, like the rest of the front in Finland after the end of 1941, more or less static. British and American munitions unloaded from the convoy ships reached the main Russian forces via a single railway line between the coast and Moscow, which ran within easy fighter range behind the front. The presence of the terminal ports of the convoy routes meant that a somewhat higher proportion of Allied Lend-Lease equipment was used in the far north and in Finland, especially when Lend-Lease planes began to arrive. Though fighting on the ground may have entered a period of lull, clashes between Russian and Finnish aircraft continued over the front line. Squadron LLV-24, its 4 flights equipped with a little over 30 Brewster 239 fighters, operated in the more southerly portion of this battlefield, in the regions of the Big Lakes and towards the Gulf of Finland. The 239 was an export variant of the U.S. Navy's F-2A Buffalo. It was very similar to the F-2A-1 model, differing chiefly by the deletion of the carrier gear and other Navy-specific equipment, and with 2 50 calibers in the wings as well as the pair of machine guns in the engine cowling. The Finns had further modified the 239s between the close of the Winter War and the beginning of the Continuation War by adding armored protection for the pilot and reflector-type gun sights procured from the British. They had arrived in Finland just as the Winter War was ending and saw virtually no action in that conflict. LLV-24 was one of the best Finnish fighter units, and it established a credible Winter War record against the Russians flying Fokker D-21s. As 1941 came to a close, newer types of aircraft began to appear on the Soviet side to accompany and eventually displace the older I-153 and I-16 fighters and the SB and DB type medium bombers that up to now had made up the bulk of the Soviet aerial opposition. At the end of the last episode, we looked briefly at a combat between an element of LLV-24 and Russian Lag-3 monoplane fighters guarding a Petlyakov PE-2 twin-engine bomber. More capable planes like this were soon to be joined by another type of similar capability, namely British Hawker Hurricanes supplied to the Russians via the Lend-Lease agreements. Hurricanes were the first Western fighters supplied to the Russians by Lend-Lease. At first, the machines were accompanied by part of the RAF's 151 wing, who were tasked with familiarizing the first batch of Soviet pilots with the British fighter. The first 39 arrived in Murmansk in September of 1941, 24 being transported and flown off the carrier HMS Argus, 12 more arriving in crated form aboard regular cargo ships. The first Hurricanes supplied to the Russians were the Mark II-B model, armed with a total of 12 .303 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings. RAF pilots accompanied their Russian protégés into battle in September and October, flying air defense missions around the port of Murmansk until the severe weather and darkness of Arctic winter made operations on the coast impossible. Once a cadre of Soviet Hurricane pilots had been established to train more of their countrymen on the machines, British pilots handed their planes over to them and departed aboard the cruiser HMS Kenya. The Russians were not very enthusiastic about the Hurricane. They found it underpowered for its size, and criticized the Merlin engine for having a short lifespan. Much of this was due to the lower quality of Russian aviation fuel, which not only decreased the Merlin's output but also wore them out faster. Indeed, the superior quality of their high-octane aviation fuel gave American and British aircraft a noticeable edge throughout the war. This is one of the lesser-known advantages of the Western Allies in the air. But whatever the cause, the Russians found the fighters' climbing and diving performance poor, and advised pilots to engage in horizontal turning maneuvers against enemy planes instead. In terms of overall maneuverability, the Hurricane was considered to be too cumbersome. One Soviet pilot, Nikolai Gerasimovich of the Soviet Northern Fleet, had this to say about it, quote, "It was not slow in responding to the control stick, but everything happened smoothly. In the I-16, if you moved the stick, the airplane inverted right away. With this beast, it would roll over very slowly." Most Russians, it seems, thought of the Hurricane as a relatively large, sluggish, and underpowered gun bus whose weapons were formidable only at point-blank range. The Soviets were very critical of the Hurricane's armament. The 12 guns included on the fighter would certainly make it seem heavily armed, but Soviet pilots complained of having to close a very short range in order for the .303 caliber guns to have much effect, and of the need to make many hits on an enemy plane to do serious damage. This difference in perception probably had a lot to do with the difference in interwar experience between Soviet and Western pilots. The previous generation of Russian fighters, the I-15s and I-16s, carried 12.7mm machine guns and sometimes 20mm cannon, while British and American planes carried rifle-caliber weapons almost exclusively. Used to the longer-range guns, the Russians were very likely to perceive 30 caliber range as very short, while the same distance would seem normal to an RAF airman. Many of the Russian Hurricanes were therefore modified to carry 12.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannon. These modified Hurricanes were therefore often the most heavily armed fighters in the sky in this area during the first year of the war. This heavy, long-range punch would be a compensation for the plane's otherwise lackluster performance. Soviet Hurricanes were used by the Russian Navy, as well as the Air Force, and all throughout the Eastern Front. Though initially they were concentrated here in the far north, used to defend ports in which they had arrived against frequent Luftwaffe raids. Later they flew escort as well as air defense missions. The Russians were very impressed with the UHF radio equipment installed in the British machines. In 1941, still only a minority of Soviet-built fighters had radio. Hurricanes were involved in the last major action fought by the Brewster 239 pilots of LLB-24 in 1941. On the 17th of December, two sections of 239s encountered 3 Hurricanes of the 152nd Fighter Regiment in company with 6 I-153 Chaikas from the 65th Attack Aviation Regiment over the railway near Maselka. The Chaikas were biplane fighters that were often used in a ground attack role. The Russians were flying at an altitude of 1,000 meters, or about 3,300 feet. The Finns approached from above and made diving attacks on the enemy formation. They reported that the Soviet planes did not change speed or altitude during the action, nor did the Hurricanes attempt to protect the ground attack planes. 5 kills were claimed by the Finns, 2 of them to Captain Jorma Karhunen, who downed one of the Hurricanes as well as an I-153. By the end of the year, Squadron LLV-24 had been in combat for 6 months and was credited with the destruction of 135 Russian aircraft. This had been achieved for the loss of only 2 Brewsters and 2 pilots. Only one of these losses had been the result of combat, namely when fighter number BW-385, flown by Lieutenant Henrik Elfving, was brought down by Russian flak on the 3rd of December. No air-to-air losses had been recorded. This remarkable performance would remain typical of the Finnish Brewsters. In stark contrast to its subpar record in American, Dutch, and British Commonwealth service, in the hands of the Finns, the Buffalo would achieve perhaps the most successful record in air-to-air combat of any fighter on any side in the war, the ratio of kills to losses of at least 17-1. As 1942 began, LLV-24 was still under the command of Gustav Magnusson, now lieutenant colonel, who had his headquarters at Condepoga, the western shore of Lake Onega. This time the squadron was dispersed in flights. First flight, with 7239s under Captain Aino Lukanen, was based at Normoila, near the front in the southern Olonets. Second flight, led by Captain Leo A. Hola, had 6 fighters at Malmi near the capital. Third flight, with 11 fighters under Captain Karhunen, and fourth flight, with 8 more under Captain Per Silvilius, were both based at the Condepoga HQ. Across the lines, they faced the Soviet 152nd Fighter Regiment and the 65th Attack Aviation Regiment based to the east, as well as the 415th and 524th Fighter Regiments and the 4th Guards Bomber Aviation Regiment, flying from bases lying to the south of the Olonets. In terms of numbers of operational aircraft, the Russians outnumbered the Finns, but if Luftwaffe formations are included, two sides are more or less evenly balanced. By the end of the year, the Lend-Lease hurricanes were becoming common in the area of Rukajärvi, to the southwest of the ports of the White Sea, having been moved away from the more inhospitable regions of the coast during the deep winter months. Like most Russian air units in the deep winter months in this theater, they were tasked with protecting the Murmansk-Moscow Railway, as well as supporting Red Army forces defending the vital junction at Soroka. The intensification of Soviet air activity here as winter deepened prompted the relocation of Captain Ahola's second flight from Malmi to Tikhsjarvi, closer to the scene, on the 8th of January. The next significant clash in the air would come the next day in the Maselka area, where 4 Tu-39s led by Captain Sevilius surprised the formation of 15 R-5 scout bombers and 6 I-153s over Lake Segozero. The R-5 was a 2-seat, single-engined, open-cockpit biplane. It entered service in 1930 and served as a light bomber and reconnaissance machine during the interwar years, seeing action in Mongolia, Spain, Poland, and most recently against the Finns during the Winter War. Its effect on Finnish ground troops during this war can be gathered from its nickname, Hermosaha, or nerve saw. This aircraft was obsolete in 1942, and was usually used only at night, since it was a sitting duck in daylight. This action has proved no exception to this rule. The Finns shot down 4 of the R-5s and 1 of the I-153s without loss. The second flight did not see much action over its new Tikhsjarvi station until the 1st of February, when one section encountered a small group of Lag 3s and shot 2 of them down in the area of Kapaselka. Not long after this, on the 6th, a formation of 8 Tu-39s from the 3rd and 4th flights, led by Sevilius, ran into 7 SB medium bombers escorted by a dozen MiG-3s. A short but violent action resulted, in which the Finns took down 2 of the SBs and 2 of the fighters. Both of the bombers were shot down by Warrant Officer Ilmari Jutlainen, wrote this in his combat report, quote, "I noticed the bombers at 3,000 meters and radioed the boys about them. As we intercepted the Soviet aircraft, I spotted a formation of 3 SBs heading for a nearby railway line and dove after them. Targeting the aircraft to the left of the formation, my fire set its port wing aflame. The SB crashed next to the railway line. As I started after the lead bomber, I observed a MiG fighter closing in on me. In spite of the threat posed by the latter, I managed to hit the bomber in the starboard engine, which poured out smoke and oil. Moments later, the aeroplane rolled over to the right, plunged into the forest close to the railway line. Jutalainen then became involved in a 5-minute dogfight with a group of 5 or 6 MiGs which had gained a height advantage on him, came down one by one making diving attacks. Dodging repeated firing passes from the oncoming MiGs, he was eventually able to get above them and shake them off, and then make his escape. The MiG-3 was similar in appearance to the Hurricane, and it's possible that the Finns misidentified Lend-Lease Hurricanes in this and other instances. Another clash with supposed MiGs took place on the 26th of February, again over Lake Segozero, when 7 Brewsters of the 3rd Flight tangled with 15 Russians from the 609th Fighter Regiment. The Finns were again victorious in this battle, shooting down 7 of the enemy planes for the loss of 1 of their own, fighter number BW-359, flown by Sergeant Tauno Heinonen. The remainder of February and March saw the various flights of LLV-24 engage in similar actions with formations of medium bombers escorted by fighters that might have been Hurricanes or MiGs. A few times the air patrol missions were interspersed with ground strafing missions. though these were normally avoided due to the risk of losing fighters to ground fire. In one of the ground attack missions that was undertaken, Captain Ahola led 4 239s against a group of parked Soviet aircraft that had been identified by reconnaissance near Sukhojavy. These braved the Russian flak and shot up a pair of Ilyushin DB-3 twin-engine bombers and an I-16 fighter that they found there before returning to the base. But in general terms, the pace of operations was slow and actions infrequent in February and into March, as the deep cold and severe weather limited the ability of both sides to operate their aircraft. Finns faced an additional difficulty with their fighters as the war progressed. Now that the Americans were in the war on the Soviet side, spare parts for the American-built fighters and their Cyclone engines were no longer forthcoming. Some spare parts and engines were included with the original Brewster contract, and the skill of the Finnish ground crews could only go so far in the face of a lack of replacement parts. They sought a solution for the engine problems by adapting the planes to use captured Russian M63 radial engines, which were in fact license-built copies of the Wright Cyclone. The Finnish State Aircraft Factory also began a program to build a domestically built version of the Brewster, known as the Humu, using the M63 engine and with wings made of plywood. This project resulted in the production of only a single aircraft, however. The need to resort to this expedient was symptomatic of Finland's unique military position in the larger picture of the Second World War. In many ways, the Finns fought a parallel war, a Finno-Soviet war that was separate from and superimposed on the larger conflict between the Axis and the Allies in Europe. During the Winter War, the Finnish cause was a popular one in the Western countries, where the struggle was often depicted as a David versus Goliath story with the Finns as the sympathetic underdog, a valiant nation of citizen soldiers bravely and skillfully holding out against an unprovoked attack by the uninspired conscript legions of Stalin's ponderous gray empire. This led to an anomalous position when these nations entered the fight in alliance with the Soviets. The Finnish alignment, Germans, was obviously pragmatic strategically, as the victor in the titanic struggle between the two totalitarian giants would be very dangerous to a small nation, whichever one prevailed. An alignment with the Soviets was unlikely, given the recent war. If the Germans prevailed against the Soviets, then Finland would face a victorious Wehrmacht that had subdued its last continental rival, and had two land frontiers with their country on opposite fronts, the northern border with Norway and the eastern one between the Gulf of Finland and the White Sea coast. In such a vulnerable position, it would be better to live in such a future Europe as a partner of Germany than as an enemy or even as a neutral. In the case of a Soviet victory, it was unlikely, given the recent invasion, to make much difference if the Finns held themselves aloof from the massive war between the two empires. The position of the Finns is similar in some respects to an episode from the ancient wars between Rome and Carthage, as recounted to us by Livy. The Aetolian League, a confederation of Greek cities bordering the great Macedonian monarchy, was approached by one of the Roman consuls, Marcus Valerius Laevinus, in 210 BC. Along with a legion and a fleet, he brought an offer of alliance against the Macedonians. The Aetolians were valiant and warlike people, but much less powerful than Macedon. The Romans had turned a corner in the long struggle against Carthage. The mighty city of Syracuse, in Sicily, an old Roman ally that had joined the Carthaginian cause following a revolution in her government, had fallen to them the previous year, as had Capua, a rival metropolis not far from Rome itself, the territory of Campania, which had betrayed the Republic and gone over to the enemy in Rome's darkest hour. As a result of the triumphs of this year, Rome was confident enough to plan the expansion of her power into Greece, and the Aetolians were the first Greek state with which they sought an alliance. The Aetolians, like the Finns, had recently suffered aggression from their neighbors, in this case Macedon and her clients. The Romans offered her the return of their lost towns and territories. The Aetolians were caught between two much larger military powers, and were faced with the choice of alignment with one or the other great powers, and the attendant risks and benefits of that choice, or becoming one of the battlefields in the struggle between them. The Aetolians took the Roman offer and made war on Macedon, or rather on her clients the Acarnanians. With the help of the consul's forces, they took back the important harbor of Naupactus. The League became the first Roman bridgehead in Greece proper, bringing, as the Roman historian puts it, quote, the certain prospect of Roman power in the east. Finns, faced with a similar existential threat to their newly independent nation, chose alignment with the Germans, which offered the best range of outcomes for their survival as an independent state. And so that is where I will end this video. I hope you found some of it interesting, and I hope you come back for the next part of the series, as we continue the story of the Finnish Brewsters and their struggle against the steadily growing power of the Soviet Air Force. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoy my efforts here, maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. The link is in the description along with the video sources. In any case, till next time, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.